I'm going to disclose the true facts of our plight and condition. I ask that you don't dispute facts you don't understand for lies you've been misled to believe, because doing so will keep you mentally enslaved by the white oppressors. As long as we continue to assign our plight to a biblical fairy tale and connect our collective condition to a silly slave syndrome myth, we'll remain forever mentally enslaved by the white oppressors. We will remain their mentally enslaved fools. Remember that I never said that what I teach will be easy for all to comprehend and understand. I only said that it will be the black mental liberating truth, the absolute truth that emancipates our minds from white mental slavery. Here are 9 ways of how the African American culture has profoundly changed since the 1960s. During the 1960s, the majority of African Americans were demanding black liberation. Today, in direct contrast, many no longer demands black liberation. The majority now merely seeks a comfortable footing within the system of white supremacy. In fact, many African Americans openly respond by saying they don't want to hear that black liberation shit whenever the topic is even mentioned. During the 1960s, the majority of African Americans perceived white oppressive forces as being our worst enemies. Today, in direct contrast, millions now insist that it's ourselves that are now our worst enemies. During the 1960s, African Americans call ourselves brothers and sisters, and we called our oppressors crackers. Today, millions now call ourselves niggers and bitches, and we call our oppressors white people. Clearly, we're now respecting ourselves much lesser and respecting them much more. During the 1960s, African American women proudly wore their natural afros and cornrows like African crowns, thus demonstrated immense black pride. Today, in direct contrast, the majority of African American women conceals their natural hair under European weaves. Millions are ashamed to be publicly seen showcasing their natural hair. During the 1960s, African Americans strongly embraced our African heritage. Many wore dashikis and gave themselves African names. Today, in direct contrast, many African Americans have been made so ashamed of their African heritage that many will now accept any ridiculous theory that allows them to claim themselves as being anything other than an African. In fact, today, many African Americans would rather be called a nigger than an African. This is a sad, true fact. During the 1960s, African Americans' unified protest against the U.S. system of white supremacy was unprecedented, and it still remains unrivaled by any other group in U.S. history. Today, in direct contrast, African Americans are now more divided than any previous time in history. These profound noted changes within the African American culture clearly benefits the white society. It's always by deliberate design whenever the oppressed culture changes in ways that benefits the oppressors. I know many insist that our collective condition is caused by a slave syndrome myth, but this is untrue. Those who believe they are controlled by slave syndrome do so because they're ignorant. Whenever people are ignorant, they'll always believe nonsense. Because that silly slave syndrome myth presents what would in fact be the least effective method used for controlling generations of people. That myth is simply not how true brainwashing is achieved. True brainwashing apparatus requires a system that's being constantly reapplied and reinforced upon the targeted population in order to remain effective. Furthermore, the fact that we as a culture are now more mentally enslaved today than we were more closely following slavery during the 60s, as I pointed out, is proof that our current collective condition is not connected to slavery. Because if our collective condition was connected to slavery, then it would lessen with each new generation as we move further away from the era of slavery. However, this is not the case at all. We are worse off today than we were during the 1960s. That fact proves that our collective condition has nothing to do with a slave syndrome myth. It's something else. Usually people have the right to believe whatever they choose to believe. However, there's a profound exception to this rule when it comes to the oppressed. The oppressed must gain a clear and concise understanding of our plight and condition. The oppressed must function based upon what's actually true, because if our understandings are flawed, then all liberating remedies and strategies that stem from those misunderstandings will also be flawed. The oppressed must function based upon what is actually true in order to develop the proper solutions necessary to liberate ourselves. This is why those who know the truth must teach African proverb. The truth of our current plight and condition is that white oppressive forces have exploited their monopoly over information that are systematically fed into our collective minds to deploy an insidious ideological subversion system against the Black population. Ideological subversion is an offensive psychological warfare tool that uses misinformation and deception as a weapon to manipulate targeted population to think in ways that are against their own self-interest. Ideological subversion changes what people believe or changes their perception of reality. The purpose of such propaganda-driven mythology is to attack a people at a psychological level in a bid to destabilize and undermine their entire culture. This is what's being done to us. The ultimate goal is the complete collapse of the targeted population's culture. This brainwashing system is a slow and gradual process. It spreads so much disinformation and misinformation into the Black community until virtually everything that Black people believes are lies. Lies that hinders our liberation. It confuses the Black community to such an extent that despite the abundance of available information, no one is able to come together to make any sensible conclusion in the interest of defending ourselves or our communities. This ideological subversion system was developed in response to the unprecedented unified Black protests demonstrated during the 1960s. As I said, during the 1960s, African American unified protests was unprecedented. And it still remains unrivaled by any other group in U.S. history. In response to it, white social scientists were hired to study the Black community, find the cause of the problem, and then develop solutions to counter the problem. They determined that they could subdue unified Black protests by deploying an ideological subversion system that manipulates the collective minds of Black people to think in ways that would prevent us from engaging unified Black protests against the white society. The white oppressor's ideological subversion system is being systematically deployed against Black people through 6 different ways. The first one, destabilization. They created unfair laws designed to mass incarcerate millions of Black fathers, removing them from the home. They also create financial assistance programs that stipulated that required the fathers to remain out the home in order for the woman to receive the benefits. This destabilized the Black family. Removing the Black father from the home made the Black family more vulnerable to the white oppressor's ideological subversion systems. The second tactic requires crisis. They constantly tell us that we're within a state of crisis to convey the belief that we therefore need whites to govern over our lives. They also constantly exaggerate the issue of Black on Black crime on their news so that we live in fear of each other and think the worst of each other. These propaganda campaigns not only makes black people more compliant with white dominance over our lives, they in many cases cause black people to prefer white dominance over our lives. This is our hidden reality. The next thing they used was miseducation. They secretly began the process during our early educational development, when our minds are young and most impressionable, wherein which black students are being miseducated through the racist educational curriculum that exaggerates and exemplifies the achievements and history of only whites, while rendering black students totally ignorant of their own past achievement and history. Essentially, the self-image and self-esteem of black students are being systematically diminished by an educational curriculum that's designed to inspire only white students. For most black children, their schools are the places where they first experience the implication that whites are inherently superior to blacks. This is being deliberately done. This practice is essential in maintaining white social dominance over black people. Because according to social scientists, in order for a dominant group to maintain this position of social dominance over the oppressed, they must condition the oppressed to accept their subordinate status. And this is achieved by denying the oppressed of a racially affirming curriculum. When the oppressed are denied of a racially affirming curriculum, this conditions them to accept their subordinate status within the society. This is what's being done to black people. This is why we're learning more black racially affirming facts from each other on social media than we do so from within our schools. When the oppressed population is denied of a racially affirming education, even the brightest among them have little of any hope of mentally extracting themselves from their assigned low-dominated position within the society. As a means of maintaining the current status quo, black people are being brainwashed during our education development to think in ways that makes us accept white dominance over our lives, while white students are being miseducated to believe that they're inherently superior and are therefore supposed to rule over black people. This is how they maintain their dominance over black people. Our greatest problem is that most of us are ignorant of how our minds are constantly being manipulated to think in ways that serve the system of white supremacy. It is the reality that they brainwash many of us not to see. Naturally, black students are very vulnerable to such a demoralizing setting because they are subjected to it for 7 hours a day from the age of 5 through 18. Clearly, considerable damages can be done to the mental health of many black children under such a large time frame. 4, the next phase is demoralization. Whenever those in power want to brainwash an entire generation of people to think and behave as they want them to think, they do so by heavily demoralizing them. This divides them, makes them self-loathing, and makes them much easier to control. This is the warfare tactic that's presently being deployed against black people. The white media's unrelenting negative depiction of black people that constantly subjects black people to receiving only the fraudulent, worst narratives about ourselves. It's much more than just biased media reporting. It's in fact a black racially demoralizing, divide and rule psychological warfare campaign. Demoralize, divide, and rule is a method of maintaining control over a targeted population through unrelenting demoralization in order to create self-hatred and disunity amongst them. It's a well-proven tactic because when the oppressed are heavily demoralized, this creates self-hatred and disunity, which attacks the core foundation of what bonds them as a people, and they can then be ruled over forever. This mass manipulation system is deployed against black people like a massive media marketing campaign that constantly subjects Black people to receiving only the fraudulent worst narratives about ourselves. Within this system, fraudulent Black racially demoralizing propaganda is being pumped unrelentingly into the unsuspecting minds of Black people without being challenged or counterbalanced by an equal amount of Black positive racially affirming information. Its weapon is the message that it carries and the way that it negatively affects the Black population in terms of our behavior. It conveys a subliminal message that Black people are now our own worst enemies and that we therefore need whites to govern over our lives. Moreover, that Black people should admire, respect, and trust only whites. This system is extremely effective because when Black people are repetitively presented these noted narratives from trusted white media sources, it can be very difficult to resist its implied programming, especially when the propaganda is being told daily and so unrelentingly. With time being unable to refute the constant negative information about ourselves, many Black people eventually accept it. They accept the narratives about us as being true. This creates the feelings of self-hate. This makes us resentful towards our own people. This manipulation system utilizes the immense power that shame has upon the human mind to mentally enslave millions of Black people. Now, here's how they turn millions of African Americans against Africa. Here's how and why. In 1968, white social scientists had also determined that African Americans had developed an allegiance towards Africa that hindered the growth of our Black patriotism toward the U.S. government. African American allegiance toward Africa was very strong during the 1960s. This was made evident by the fact that many African Americans had started wearing the afros, the cornrows, dashikis, and many were giving themselves African names. White social scientists determined that millions of African Americans had developed a romanticized allegiance toward Africa that prevented Black allegiances from growing towards the U.S. Moreover, that this allegiance fueled the Black Pride movement, which was a core aggravating factor for that decade's unprecedented unified Black protests. They therefore decided that the African Americans' allegiance towards Africa had to be eroded. To turn African Americans against Africa, white propagandists were hired to begin negatively distorting the image of Africa. They constantly subject African Americans to seeing only those images of war-torn, famine-ridden, rapidly illiterate, and disease-stricken Africa. By only showing the poorest parts of Africa, this turned Africa into a source of shame and humiliation for millions of African Americans. You see, it's easier to separate a people from their homeland when they've been made to be ashamed of it. Those negative images of Africa also subliminally conveys the message that African Americans we actually benefited from slavery. It makes many perceive that the enslavement of our ancestors as being more of a rescue mission that ultimately took us away from the backwards, evil, scary place of Africa. This propaganda campaign literally causes many African Americans to feel grateful that slavery happened. This significantly eases African Americans' collective aggressions towards the white society. It also broke down the African American sense of Black racial heritage and allegiance towards Africa. It also prevents many of us from demanding the reparation that we're still owed. Black liberation will only be possible when we elevate our minds above the biblical fairy tale and the silly slave syndrome myth and start functioning off of the truth of our plight and condition, the reality of the war that's been waged against our minds. It's time to wake up and learn the truth. You can learn more by ordering my book, The Black People's Matrix, at www.theblackpeoplesmatrix.com. One love and peace, brothers and sisters. One love and peace.